Reactive Training Systems.
Hey, welcome back to the RTS podcast. Today I'm talking to Dr. Mike Zourdos. He's a good friend of mine, and we go back quite a few years. And if you've heard other uh, interviews and whatnot with him, he doesn't do a lot of podcasts and interviews, but if you have heard any of his other stuff in the past, this will definitely be a different style. We don't do a whole lot of the hey, introduce yourself kind of pieces to this podcast, and we don't ask a lot of the same old questions. This is basically me and a smart friend of mine having a conversation about training. We start by talking about fatigue and kind of my psychosis about fatigue over the last over a year now. But quickly we range into other topics from performing singles in training to whether sensitivity to training is a thing or not, where fatigue might come from, different ways of organizing your training, what variety in training is, changes to the environment and the training environment, and things like that. So we kind of end up all over the place, but I think there's a lot of uh, potential tips, things that you will things that can make a positive impact on your training, help you make better training decisions and make better progress, get more out of your training. And that's kind of the idea, right? So hopefully you guys enjoy this conversation. So here we go, Dr. Mike Zourdos. Even like, what do we mean by fatigue? Like we say fatigue, and that's maybe kind of my more late term thought, I guess, is like in a practical setting, you athlete says I'm fatigued or I'm beat up or I'm tired. Like those all mean subtly different things. And could it be that there's different things that need to be treated differently? I mean, like I mentioned before, as far as I know, I mean, you're a lot more current on all this stuff than me by a mile. But my understanding is that even like the grogginess feelings and stuff like that tend to be higher on training sessions that do a lot of damage. You know, and now I don't know. That may be a product of experience too, because like lifters, like experienced powerlifters, have always talked about feeling that sort of baked feeling post competition, which tends to be the lowest volume of sessions that they do. Um, I mean, they're maximum lifts, so you can factor that in there, but there shouldn't be as much damage in a situation like that. Would you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be as much damage from a competition, of course. I think it's a really good observation, though, is that after a competition, a lot of people will really be kind of in a tough way for a few days. So I'm going to mention like what competitions I would perceive. I guess I would typically see this from, and then how I think that kind of supports what I'm about to say next. And that I would probably perceive that more so from high level competitions rather than local competitions. And so I would attribute that not necessarily to the actual training or lifting on the arousal for such a high level competition is just going to be so much higher than a local meet. Somebody has, a qualifying total riding on it, a medal riding on it, positions riding on it, placing riding on it. And so they're just that much more amped up for it. And if you think of a meet like that too, it might take all day, right? Like you and I competed in a meet however many years ago together, and I think there were only like 10 of us, and it was over in less than 2.5 hours or whatever. And so when you have a meet that's all day, and you're probably under eating on the day for how long it lasts. You're probably taking more caffeine or more stimulants than you usually do. to keep the arousal up as high as you can all day. The anxiety is probably a little bit higher all day. And just the uneasy feeling of not knowing what to expect and getting so amped up for each lift, and doing all 3 lifts in the same day, I think tends to play a role in the fatigue or the grogginess as you talk about that someone's feeling the next day. That's of course not a super scientific answer, but it's interesting in that. But I do think that's a little bit of a different feeling than the muscle damage that someone might get from a really high volume training session if they're in some sort of volume block. There can certainly be some grogginess along with it, but if somebody's done, let's say, some high rep training or something that causes a lot of damage, like some high rep RDLs or lunges or something like that, and then they have a hard time really moving around the next few days, that's a different type of soreness than somebody's going to get after a competition. And I think that we can kind of distinguish from that. So it doesn't mean that grogginess can't be like an outcome of both. So it could still manifest from muscle damage, but I think after a meet, it's manifesting in a little bit of a different manner. And I think you see this because so not only just fatigue, but then like what fatigue causes. So if you're fatigued from a competition, your 1RM would be pretty low the next few days if you're just coming off of a meet. But if you do, let's say, a high volume session, like your ability to perform a 1RM recovers much more quickly than your ability to perform volume. And there's some data within the past year to be able to see that. So I think just because the grogginess feeling occurs, you can still have different types of fatigue. So then the question becomes, what types of fatigue are those? Is it neuromuscular fatigue, which is probably what's happening from a competition, where your acute neuromuscular performance is hindered? But if you do a high volume training session, and there's a study I'm referring to from Ferreira in 2017 that did 8 sets of 10 on the bench press, and the subjects were fatigued, and they tested ability to perform volume and peak torque or peak strength over the next few days, and peak strength recovered much more quickly than their ability to perform volume. And that's probably due to factors associated with muscle contractions, like calcium handling. Like the ability inside skeletal muscle of calcium, of enough calcium to be there. And there seems to be enough calcium for one contraction, but maybe not enough for multiple contractions when you're in that state of fatigue. So grogginess can kind of come from either of those, but the type of fatigue you have then is going to manifest in different ways, and then might affect the type of training that you do for the rest of that week or for the rest of the next couple of weeks, and how you go about it. So it's a really interesting concept. I guess fatigue in general, I would define as just any drop in motor output, but that is a super generic definition, which then you have all of these different types of fatigue. And just because we know what types of fatigue you have, neuromuscular fatigue, maybe acutely there's some sort of metabolic fatigue. People, of course, throw around the word central fatigue, but don't really define it. And then the question becomes, how does that affect things over the next few days? It's one thing to be able to distinguish, hey, this is neuromuscular fatigue, but what does that mean in terms of performance the next few days, and then how you should measure readiness and how you should measure training? So I know there's a lot there, but I guess just to a brief answer is, from a competition, I would say it's probably due to the arousal, and that would probably harm like your peak strength the next few days. And then from a hard training session with a lot of damage, that's more on the muscular level and is really just harming your ability to perform volume the next few days and affecting things like calcium handling, if you will.
Yeah. You know, I wish that I had the study reference for the, you know, as far as like what I'm referring to when I said that, you know, fatigue seems to be related to muscle damage. I mean, obviously in part, yeah, but like even the things that strike us as more central, being linked back to that. I wonder if that's maybe a factor of training level, you know, because if I think back to like what my own experiences are as an athlete, like I remember hearing you know, old timer powerlifters talk about how draining like maxes are and RM sets and competitions and things like that. And it just wasn't for me at the time, you know, and it's not for quite a long time, you know. So unless you're at a pretty high training stance, you just might not get that, you know, you might not experience that psychological anxiety linked type of fatigue. I mean, it's probably not cool of me to raise a criticism or potential criticism without like the actual reference in hand. But, I mean, I think it's probably pretty safe to say that we're not talking about veteran powerlifters in any sort of exercise science setting, right? So
my only question is, are you an old-time powerlifter now, Mike?
I think I am. I think I've crossed that line. Gray in the beard and talk about back in my day a lot.
Congratulations.
I shake my fist at people sometimes too.
That's a good metric for it.
What's that a symptom of?
When you watch TV, do you say it's time for my program?
Seneca gets mad if you don't watch his shows, though.
Yeah. Kids can get unreasonably mad when you don't watch their shows. That's another podcast, though.
Right. No, I think that experience level is gonna play a big part in that.
So, I mean, I think it's experience level. I agree with your assertion, though, that I've never found 1RMs to be really draining. And I actually find, like, if somebody's going to go to the end of a block, and I know I do this with clients, I saw like a few years ago there was a trend instead of testing 1RMs all the time, which I think is a good trend because we don't need to constantly test. But people say, hey, I'm going to test a 10RM or max reps with this weight. And if you could do, 5 reps with 400 pounds before the block and you can do 8 reps with it after, you got stronger. And that's fine. But doing a 8RM is a lot more draining than doing a 1RM. So if somebody tests that, the next week is probably going to be pretty difficult. Or going to have to run another, maybe they taper to do the testing, have to run another deload week or 2 or something, rather than if you test a 1RM, especially in the gym, and your arousal is not going to be as high as it's going to be at a meet, you're going to be in and out of the gym in an hour or whatever it is. I don't see that as a super draining thing. I mean, you might want to run an introductory week next week or decrease things a little bit, but that's probably a good idea anyway. So I think if you don't do something frequently, it's draining. Anything that's a new stimulus, right?
I think that's a big part of it. Like I've got into it with some people over this before as well. Like yeah, if you never touch, like the whole powerlifter perception of weights over 90%.
Right.
We used to say kill the CNS, but people don't say that anymore.
Good. That's good.
Right. But some people are still afraid of those weights, and I think you're absolutely right. How familiar you are with it. Like if it's something you've never touched, then when you do, it's going to be, especially since you're talking about a power lifter who cares about their sport, who handling heavy weights is what they're supposed to be good at and what they're supposed to be getting better at by spending all this time in the gym. And putting a lot of, like, that's the thing that carries the most psychological weight. And you never do it, and now you do it. It's got a lot of baggage that comes along with it.
Yeah, and training that is a skill. It's not just when we talk about skill. I think maybe 10 years ago or even less, we were talking about a lot about just technique, and that's part of it, of course. But it's a skill at the heavy weights. We all know that training at heavy loads is way different than training at lighter loads. We have a paper, I was going to say hopefully coming out. It's in revision in a journal right now, and so we're making the revisions on it, and hopefully we do a good enough job. But one of the things that we showed, which is one of the more minor factors, but that the eccentric duration at a 1RM is different than the eccentric duration at 80% of 1RM on a squat and bench press, and different than that at 60%, meaning that people are simply moving slower. It's a different movement. It's a different skill. And so if you're not practicing that, you're just not going to be very good at it. Not to mention the more physiological reasons that there's skills that are trainable, right? Like something like muscle fiber conduction velocity, which is the quickness at which you can transmit an action potential that's sent from the somatic nervous system to skeletal muscle, and then the next action potential that's sent from inside skeletal muscle. And these things can play a role, at least I hypothesize, in rate of force development and somebody's ability to overcome a heavy load. you're not really going to be able to improve that ability at just training at lighter loads and only touching the heavy loads infrequently. And one thing I think, Mike, you've brought to the forefront over the past few years is, and a lot of people are catching on now, and I'm one of the followers, if you will, that's caught on, is to perform relatively frequent singles at an 8, right? At an 8 RP, and do something like that, or at, if you're using velocity based training, 0.35 meters per second, or whatever would correlate to about 90% ish for most. And once you do something like that and you do it frequently, it's just not a big deal to touch those weights.
Yeah.
And then you can go ahead and do your volume afterwards. People say, hey, well, if I do this and then I have volume to do afterwards, there's evidence that might even improve your ability to perform the volume afterwards, to give you some sort of potentiation effect. So I think staying away from those weights is a mistake when people stay away from them frequently. But at the same time, though, the hesitation, and you said this as well, the hesitation is understood. I get it. Anything that's new or anything that you don't do is fatiguing. So it's just the same concept as if somebody's just, training a lift once a week, and then they are pretty beat up from it, and you try to get them to introduce it twice a week. The immediate reaction is going to be pushback. It's going to be, well, I can't deadlift more than once a week. That's going to be quite fatiguing. But then if you just allocate their volume a little bit differently throughout the 2 days and add that second day in a little bit lighter and build them up, all of a sudden they're able to do it without issue, and they're probably going to see some better adaptations because of that. And so I think this is the same concept. If it's a tough buy-in for some, but if you can get them to buy in, then I think they're going to see the benefit of it. So the hesitation is understood from a lot of people to be able to do that, or to want to stay away from that. But it's a skill, man. If you're not going to be practicing those weights and you're only going to touch them every once in a while, you're going to say, oh, doing a 1RM or doing doubles at 90% is so fatiguing. But if you start doing it all the time, you're going to say, not only is this not fatiguing, but I feel more comfortable and I'm getting stronger. And I think the other aspect too is when people think of training at 90% or above, they're always thinking of doing something hard. A single at 88, 89, 90 is not hard. So you don't have to train there and go to failure, or you don't, just because you're training over 90% doesn't mean you have to try a new PR that day. You can just do one single at 90% once a week or once every other week. And if you were to do that every couple of weeks, even if you're doing a volume block, you do a single at, if you're a power lifter, sure, if we think of old periodization constructs, and I know that's something that you and I would probably both critique, but if we think of that, people saying, hey, I'm going to do all this volume work far out from a competition. Okay, that's fine. But even then, you can still do even if it's a single out of 7 RPE, you can still do that, and your strength is going to maintain a lot better than it would otherwise if you're just doing something unspecific. You don't even have to do volume on the main lifts. You just do one single out of squat at a 7 and then go have some fun and do something else. And you're going to be in pretty good shape. So anyways, the short answer being, if you don't practice something, of course it's fatiguing. It's new. It's a new stimulus.
Yeah. We were just kind of kicking around that idea a little bit in one of our coaches meetings this week. So we have these development blocks. In between a development block is a pivot, and we go into a lot of detail on it on our YouTube channel, but I'll spare you all that. But you can think of it like a deload. One of the goals of it is to reduce fatigue, and this is similar to what you would do in a deload. You also want to maintain strength as much as you can while reducing fatigue and restoring sensitivity and all the other pivot goals, right? So for most people, what we end up doing is competition lift or very, very close variation, like you may do high bar, but something like 10 reps or something, that's enough to allow them to maintain strength. We're not talking about a super long block. We're talking about a couple weeks at the most, and they can maintain enough strength that they go back in the next development cycle and it's fine. Some people do seem to be really sensitive to those types of drops. And, even a week or two, they come back and it's like starting again from the beginning. So you end up with this, for some people, this is not even the majority, you end up feeling like you're in this loop of each development block, regaining all the lost ground from the pivot, you know. But we've been kicking around this idea of keeping some higher intensity work, even up to singles, you know, not as heavy as you would go in the development cycle, back it off from there a little bit, but you could take a single at a 7 RPE, or, you know, like that's going to be an 85, 88% single probably. You know, if doing a couple singles like that helps you maintain the strength a little bit better, you're just not going to impart that much fatigue with a couple easy singles like that, you know.
What I would propose to someone is, what's the downside of that? How is that harming you? Right? So I can't really see one. If maybe you're going in and it's a little bit of a time consideration for someone, but to work up to a single at 85%, you know, I mean, obviously for you or someone your strength, Mike, it's going to take a lot longer. But you know, on bench press, most people can do that really quickly. And pretty much on anything, it's not going to take up that much time. So I just don't know if I see the downside to doing that. And that's a pretty light intensity. If you can do something you can do for about 5 reps and you do it for 1, if in that block you're only touching things for volume around 75%ish at the most, then I'm not really sure if I see a downside to doing that. So I do like the thought process of it. And you had mentioned that you were doing up to singles. I would probably suggest maybe that singles are the best way to go with it. Because if you want to get volume at lower intensities, singles are probably going to be the least intrusive to be able to perform that volume. And is 2 reps at 85% really going to be better for strength than 1 rep at 85%? The peak intensity is the same. And I would say that for strength, peak intensity is what probably matters most. So that would be my assertion. I don't know if I understood that correctly. Though, you were,
No, I would say that my hesitation, and this is definitely me veering off more into, I guess, experience land a little bit, you know, but my hesitation with including it just automatically is more from a sensitivity to training standpoint. And so let me kind of explain that a little bit. So one of the goals of the pivot block is to restore sensitivity to the training stimulus. I am starting to think that that's pretty psychological, and I hesitate to even say that because I think a lot of people, when they hear you say, "Oh, it's psychological," then they think it's within your control. You know, I don't think it is. I think so. Let me back up for a second. I think that there's some value, a lot of value, in this subtle attentional quality that you have when you're doing something new. You know, you go to the gym, you're working with a new coach, you're doing a new program, something, and so now you have to pay attention. You can't go on autopilot, you know. Whereas if you come into the gym and every Monday is squat day and you go up to the squat rack and you put your shoes on and you do the thing, every Monday is the same. Yeah, the exercise is a little different, the protocol is a little different. This week is 80% instead of 75. Like, really, like, it's just not that different, right? And I wonder if after a while, you know, and there may be some physiological stuff there as well, but at least psychologically, you kind of go on autopilot, you just do your work and you move on. Whereas it seems like people who are switched on, paying attention, engaged with the training process, seem to get a little bit more out of it. And I wonder if making some changes to facilitate that helps. Part of that is the pivot block. We, you know, change exercises, even changing structure and getting away from heavy weights, the same old stuff, I think has a potential value.
I think there's a lot to that. I know, just like on a personal perspective, I've had someone else, just due to some back injuries I've had for many years. I've had a physical therapist help guide me with my training at the moment, and it's been wonderful. Like, even though, you know, programming is something that you do and I do, like, if you have someone else that can, like, you know, it's been a long time. I program for a lot of other people, as do you, but it's a long time since I've shut my mouth and sat down and done what somebody else told me to do. And I know this is something you and I have talked about over the years, but I've been super engaged. Just like, okay, I need to, one, do this first and foremost because I'm having him do this because I want to make sure I'm healthy. And I don't feel like I'm knowledgeable or an expert in that realm. But like, oh man, he's giving me this to do. I can't let him down. This is new. This is not something that I've done before. When I go in and I'm just in there for an hour and a half or whatever it is, and I can't remember the last time I've been this focused when training.
Yeah.
And it's been really nice. And I attribute a lot of that to just something novel, something new. And it's not the, I don't believe, I shouldn't say I don't believe in it, but I think there's something to it. But the sensitivity to people bring this up like, oh, well, can we desensitize ourselves to volume or to intensity? And then we jump back on it and it has this effect. Sure, to an extent, but I think that's thrown out there a lot. And I don't know how well understood that is. So I don't think it's like new training that I have a sensitivity for at the moment. I think it's what you're talking about, where psychologically I'm excited about it. I'm focused on it. I have somebody else that I'm kind of beholden to that I have to get this to, which is, one of the benefits of having a coach, which is something that I haven't had for many years. So it's nice to be able to do that. So I do get that aspect of it. One thing I was thinking of that I do sometimes, or I've done in the past few years, and I've done with a few people, Mike. So the singles at let's say a 7 or an 8, whatever it is, before the volume work. Have you ever experimented doing any of those after the volume work?
I was going to ask you the same thing, actually.
Okay.
No, I haven't, because I guess that's where my neuroticism kicks in. I tend not to be super neurotic, but on that. So like I said, if you're a powerlifter, you care about being strong, and, it hurts you a little bit to have a performance that appears, even if it's transient and all that, right?
Right.
I tend to like to include those singles first because I feel fresh. That's when I want to show what I'm capable of, and I feel like if I did it after the volume work, I'm going to be carrying some fatigue and wouldn't perform quite as well. And then I know for me too, the single is the thing that I care the most about. So I'm going to screw up that volume work a little bit so that I can save a little bit for the single, like
Right.
I know I would do that, so no, it's not something that I've personally done, but it is something that, it is something that, at least you always have to caveat things like this with a statement. My perception of how things are done at Westside, or at least at Super Training, when Mark Bell was prepping that team for powerlifting competitions, a lot more directly, and he was really heavily influenced by his time at Westside. That's something that they were doing, is on their speed day, they would do their 6 doubles or whatever it was at a speed weight. But then it's funny, like if you read the articles about Westside training, Louis would talk about, every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks they would work up to something a bit heavier. And I talked to a friend of mine who was training out Super Training with Mark Bell at the time, and he said, like, no, man, that's every week. Every week, it's like six speed doubles or whatever, and then somebody goes, we're working up, and then everybody freaking maxes out. They're like, well, that's a pretty big change,
Yeah.
Pretty
It's
big change.
What's funny is like so I want to get back to in a moment, the singles potentially after the volume.
Yeah.
But just on what you said, like forgetting like any style of training or whatever, like that's just a lot of that is lost these days, man. Like what a cool atmosphere to just be like they're working up heavy. Like nobody's going to say no if everybody else is doing it. And so like, one of my students, great guy, his name is Zach Robinson, and he said to me in our lab the other day, he goes, even if it's not the optimal program, wouldn't it be cool to just have a bunch of guys and you have a garage, bunch of lifters, and you just put the workout up for the day and you just do it, and like you just do it, and you all get in there and you all train. And he goes, a lot of that's kind of lost, like, and like,
Yeah.
I
Everybody
think
just
that's
visualizing everything, and I mean that's me. That's where I have kind of carved out my space is with the individualization. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That
yeah, just from like a fun perspective,
yeah,
like
you don't have training partners, like
yeah,
not in the same way that you would the old school way,
yeah, right. So like exactly, not in that old school way. Yeah. So like, and it's not something that like I'm advocating or like I'm running off to do, but like just in theory, like it sounds right, like it sounds cool. So I thought that was when he said that to me the other day.
And by we, I'm including myself in that. I don't think that we give it its proper respect, credence.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I
Like
mean, there could be something. We've got this tendency to kind of be hyper focused on the physiological effects to the exclusion of the psychological effects. When the thing that we care about is performance, and that there's an intermingling between those things.
Right. What's the goal? The goal is progress. The goal is performance. Right. So like everything that can impact that should be considered. And like, so like think about it. If you and me and whoever else, and let's say I don't want to fear for my life. So like if I was gonna say, if you and me and Hartman are all training together, and like if I'm training with Hartman, I just like have fear that he's gonna come up behind me with his giant forearms and just crush me at any time. And so, but like if like I still remember a training session that we got in years ago when we were all in Orlando. Yeah. Like if whoever, like you take 5 of your favorite friends that you train with, and like Jeremy's a really intense guy, which is why I enjoy training with him. Like if we all train together and we just put whatever it is up on the board and we train 3-4 times a week and we do that for a few years, how are we not going to make progress? Like it's going to work, like is it the most optimal training program? Maybe not, but maybe that atmosphere and doing that and training together and pushing ourselves would equal out or slightly outweigh training by yourself, agonizing over every detail of your training program constantly, which we all do. Like I know recently, and just the physical therapist that I mentioned that's been helping me with some things, like he's been helping me with stuff for my low back, but the rest of my training, upper body and other progressions I've been doing myself. And I got into it's not something I like to talk a lot about, Mike. But it's I've probably added 2.5 kilos to my bench press since the last time we did a podcast, which was like 4 or 5 years ago, I think.
So you're still repping the Reds, so.
It's look, as I've said before, not just anybody can rep the Reds. So if somebody thinks that they can, that's fine. And just remember, somebody might say, hey, I do reps with 4 Reds on the bench, and that's fine, but there's only one criteria. It's just 1 Red. So we bench the same, right. You and I, that's how it is. But something I've been doing is putting within reason, programming more exact loads into my programming that I know I'm going to hit at pretty submaximal RPEs, and then giving myself maybe 1 set at the end with a little more freedom. When I do that, because I'm someone, especially the last few years, I've agonized too much over things. And when I'm putting together a program, and when I've just had this down on paper, I'm doing this next week. This is what I'm doing. Oh man, it's been so much better for me. With Mike, you have a busy life. You got a family. I had a family, and I'm worrying about doing this and doing that. When I go in, it's just a lot less for me to think about. And I think it's more of just circumstance. And that's why I like the psychological aspect you're talking about, because I know for each of us, things are different than they were 10 years ago when we were training. So I know for me, if I can go in and do that, it helps a lot. And so, but back to the singles after the volume work. Yeah. So I was asking this because it's something I played around with for a few reasons. One, I played around with it because I felt like, all right, if I do a bunch of sets of 5 or 6 or whatever on squat, and then I work up to a single at an 8 after that, understanding my single at an 8 after that is going to be slightly lower than it would have been if I did it before. But I can do a weight just psychologically, and I do a weight at an 8 RPE after that volume. I know I can really do it. Like my arousal is low. It's not as high as it is before. I know I'm fatigued, and it's like for me, like I remember working up, and I did a squat single back when I was doing this at 220 kilos at an 8 after doing like a bunch of sets of 6 at around 75%ish, and that was easily the strongest I ever felt, and I was just like, oh wow, like I know I can do this weight. Whereas before, if I go in and do it before the volume, I'm not someone who's good at just kind of staying super calm. I know I don't want to say you are. I know outwardly you are, but I'm sure inside you're pretty fired up when you're training. And so I feel like I'm always kind of overshooting my RP just slightly when I do it beforehand, right? I'm like, oh, I'm going to do it at an 8. And then I check the velocity or I check how I feel. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to write an 8 down, but it was 8.5, like, did I really feel confident? But when I do it after, I stick to it. So just for me, I feel like I stick to it a little better. I'm able to stay a little calmer. And when I do something after the volume, I know that I can really do the weight, and it gives me that psychological feeling. And so if I don't typically do it after when I do really high reps, and I would call for a power lifter 8s, 9s, maybe 10s, right? For a bodybuilder, surely they're much higher than that, but I don't really do it after that just because fatigue level is so high, and there is data showing that singles before like high rep sets can potentiate the high reps. So I would typically tend to do it before out in that case. But if I'm doing a block where I'm not really going over 5s, then I've thrown it in after. And it's just something I've really enjoyed and seen some success with, and been able to gauge progress, and just being able to hit like a PR single for an 8 RPE, meaning it's your best single at an 8, but doing it after volume, just for me at least, it just builds a lot of confidence. And I've had some lifters that have seemed to like it as well, but not everybody does. Some are like, hey man, I'm not doing the single after, so then I move it. But that's kind of been my experience with it.
I know for me, I would need to come up with some rules that I make myself follow to keep from just what I was saying earlier, sandbagging the volume work, or doing something to give myself a little edge and so I could demonstrate that progress. But I mean, that's something I'm definitely open to. So any of our athletes listening to this, like if you start seeing singles after the volume work, this is why. But like, I mean,
he told me to say this, so right. we had a pre-meeting before this.
Yeah. Like, I think this kind of connects back to what I was saying earlier about variety itself. I mean, I get the feeling that there might be something to the sensitivity to training thing. Now, whether it's whatever the reason why there's something to it, I don't know, and to some extent is not important as a practitioner, just that there is, and if we can kind of understand how it works, the underlying mechanics, we'll get there when we get there. But I think variety can be used strategically. And what I've noticed is that I need to be able to make changes to my training strategy that get an appropriate stimulus to the lifter that's novel enough that it strikes that variety chord. Now, whether that's causing them to pay attention, I think that's a big part of it, or if there's some other more physiological effect. I don't know. But what I've noticed is that there are all these patterns that we tend to lock ourselves into, you know. If you like, I tend to change exercises a lot, but I've still got my exercises that are kind of home base, and if I'm writing a program and I don't have a reason to really rack my brain and think of something new, then this is what I typically pick, and that's okay to an extent. But when you kind of fall into this pattern of Monday's squat day,
Right.
every Monday's squat day. And last block I did the safety bar, and then this block I'm doing barbell squats. Like, yeah, okay, that's a big difference, but at some point, Monday's squat day, and maybe changing that, maybe going from, hey, I bench in every session, to I'm going back to an upper lower split, something like that is enough to shake things up and cause you to pay attention a little bit more. As long as, I mean, there are some basics of training that you have to adhere to. There is a such thing as bad programs,
Sure.
Or even good programs that are just ineffective.
Right.
But I think that's been a big challenge for me, is to kind of say, what pattern am I locked into with this particular athlete, and how do I get outside of that?
So I think there's a lot to it. So I was just jotting a few things down while you were going over that. It struck some thoughts, which is, so like, if you do a novel exercise, I wonder if people are more engaged, because when you do a novel exercise, you tend to make progress really quickly on that exercise.
Yeah.
Right. So, in the first week you do something, you say, hey, I'm just going to put, 60 kilos on the bar, and kind of feel this out a little bit. And then the next week it's, I'm going to go 85. And the next week, all right, I'm going to go to 100. And then you can kind of keep adding, some weight there for a little while. You're looking forward to doing it. Like, it's, you don't want to have like hey, I'm going to test my 1RM on whatever obscure exercise this is, but it's cool to be like, hey, I can really make some progress here. Maybe this is going to result in some muscle growth that is going to translate to some strength down the road, or whatever it might be. But just for the sake of doing better on that, and I think that probably helps to keep people engaged, because whenever you do something novel, you're able to progress quite quickly on it. And then, when you think of variety, like, variety doesn't have to just be in terms of like what exercises we're doing. You gave the example of variety in terms of, hey, every Monday squat day and doing the same routine. It doesn't even have to be like, hey, I train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. Sometimes we have to look back to the old school, I think, and take some of the good things from that too, which is people were doing, hey, 2 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off, something like that. I've moved to some things like that over the past few years, and it's really been fun. As kind of to have a little bit of a different schedule. Sure, sometimes you're like, hey, Saturday is my day. I have more time. I have less obligations, so I'm going to put my heaviest deadlift day here because I can focus on it. Makes sense. I get it. But things like that can help. I know for me, there's a paper that came out sometime in the past year and a half, where it showed that when you supersetting agonist-antagonist muscle groups, for example, rows with bench, you do rows after bench on a superset, not only does it not hurt the bench strength, but it made the rowing strength a little better in that study. So I started doing that a ton, and I was able to save a lot of time, which allowed me to add in some more volume on some other movements and other lifts and other days. And I was super engaged because I had to work quickly, but I was working quickly knowing that I'm not harming my strength. I'm not just taking short rests or moving for the sake of doing it, or saying, hey, people say I want to take short rests for metabolic byproducts, which don't really seem to do a whole lot for us. I was super engaged, and then I didn't have time to kind of wander off and start thinking about something else or this or whatever. And I noticed I was really focused, and so I kept that in for a long time.
Yeah.
And so anyways, those are just other examples of variety. Like, variety can mean anything. Kind of like, this is a different conversation, but it's kind of like people are so confined to terms and saying like, hey, I'm going to talk about periodization. I have to change periodization. You can periodize anything, right? It's just changing things over time, whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be involved with exercise. You can just change things. There's nutritional periodization, right? So Those are all other examples of variety.
Are you not to disrupt your train of thought or anything? I know you're quite busy, but have you got a chance to read much from Franz Bosch at all?
I have not, and I'm probably also less busy than you think. I'm mostly just outside in my driveway, getting yelled at by a toddler to draw him a hopscotch court on the on the driveway, which of course I oblige every time. That makes up about 90% of my day. I think we had 127 hopscotch jumps the other day.
Are you periodizing that volume?
No, but I should, because it was I was a little more fatigued than I should have been by going through the whole court. But no, I have not read any by that author.
All right. His work is more in track and field, but he talks about variation, and one of the things that he mentions with variation, a change to the environment, is variation as well. Now, it can take on a more physical characteristic. So, say you're a baseball pitcher, you could change the height of the mound or the distance, as a change to the environment. But I'm thinking from a powerlifter standpoint, how many powerlifters squat in the same power rack facing the same way every time, and I see this in myself. Like, I train in my garage on the same equipment with the same plates, like I just have these patterns that I fall into, right? And then I go somewhere else and there's more distractions, things are a little bit different, and I see a performance decline when I do that.
Of course. Yeah.
I think if I wanted to make myself a stronger competitor, I should seek that out and try to adapt to being a little bit more resilient to changes in the environment. But my point was that you could even include that, like that could be variation for you. Like, hey, this week I'm going to turn around in the rack and face the other direction, something.
So it probably should be, right? Like, so that's another component of specificity. If you have, playing soccer in college, we played on a grass field, and most of our games were during the day, right? And so, but if we had a night game and it was on a stadium and on turf, what did we do that week? We practiced on the turf, and we practiced under the lights. And so if you have a meet, you're going to have people walking back and forth in front of you. You're probably going to be squatting on carpet. You're going to be fighting for stuff in the warm-up room.
It's a whole the mic.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if you could get a recording of that and play it,
play that in your headphones.
You could play that while you're training. Wouldn't that be the ultimate? Like, how could you ever have a bad training session? Like, there's no way it could be bad.
If anybody's listening to this and you already do that, please write into me. I have to know.
And you have my respect and admiration forever, because there's no way you could have a bad session. But yeah, all of those factors are different, just from the atmosphere. I thought about that years ago, thinking like, hey, I train where I train. I stare at the same spot on the ground when I squat. I keep my head in the same position. But when you're at the meet, you're going to have the head referee in front of you. You're going to have people walking by. You got to find a place to look. And, often somebody walks in you at the gym, and, you hear people all the time, oh man, my set was thrown off. This person walked in front of me. Or there were squat racks facing each other and somebody else was squatting. So I waited for them to go. I know personally, I stopped doing stuff like that. I just trained, because if you're at a competition or wherever, those things are going to happen. You can't stop and say, excuse me, in the front row there. If you could sit down, I'm staring right there, and you just moved your foot and it's affecting my descent. I would appreciate it if you could not do that. So, I think there's a lot to that, to be able to just again, in all sports, if somebody knows they have some different kind of competition coming up, or there's going to be different weather where they are, they're going to train for that. They're going to practice for that week. So you should be changing up the environment, not just for the, for the sake of changing up every day. That's obviously not what we're saying, but every once in a while doing something different. And so you can just be ready. But I think what you said is observed a lot. You go to a new gym for the first time, unless it's a super, super unique situation where you walk in and you're with, some of your best friends or favorite powerlifters and you're just super amped up. You're traveling and you go to a new gym, your performance is almost always declined a little bit.
Yeah, I know that for me. And for me, what it feels like is an inability to focus at quite the same level. That the distractions or self-consciousness or something, and not self-consciousness in like a super neurotic way, but just being more aware of where, you know, you're not able to lose yourself in the task, or at least that's how I've felt about it. I think it's highly personality driven. I could see other people being completely the opposite, but for me, that's what it is. And if that's perceived to be a hole in your game, then that's something that you could shore up,
Yeah, man. Yeah, like when you go do something new as well, like there's just so much else going on around you. And like, no matter how much you try to stay focused, I wonder, like, we might perceive ourselves to be focused, or as focused as we can be, but that doesn't mean that we are, I was actually talking with my wife about this the other day, and she's been running, and she's newer at it, but she's really doing a great job. And so she's starting to kind of understand, like, hey, you're not going to get better every session, like, right? Like, it's something that you and I know, and people know they've been engaged in something for a long time. But if you're new to it, and your one day your training session isn't as good as it was the previous day, you start to get frustrated, right?
Well, there's a difference between knowing it in your head and really internalizing it too. So sorry.
That's right. And I was just saying, like, hey, you just had a race, and like, this is, these easier runs, these lower mileage that you're doing. Like, I know you didn't feel it was that good today, but like, I want you to really think, do you really think you were as focused as when you did 10 miles the other week? So it's like, we might go somewhere else, might go to a new gym or a new atmosphere, new surroundings, and you might perceive ourselves to be focused. But I think back to that session. Were you looking around at the other people in the gym? How many times check your phone? Were you traveling and thinking, oh, I have this work presentation later in the day or whatever it is? And there's all fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's just human nature. But we think, or we perceive we're focused, but then we realize, oh, it's a new atmosphere. Maybe I was looking around a little bit. Maybe I was doing whatever, and we might not have been as engaged as we should have been.
Yeah, just to sum it up maybe a little bit, it seems to me that what we're kind of circling here is something like flow state, and that a change in the environment can bring in enough distraction that you're not getting there. It's disrupting your ability to just kind of lose yourself in that task. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense if you're not as switched on as you would like to be. And that kind of goes back to the problem of us thinking that everything psychological is within our voluntary control, and it's just not the case.
Yeah, there's no way, dude. Like, we have some data here when we looked at and we saw some relationships between high cognitive anxiety and acute performance, and so kind of like the somatic anxiety is like the physical manifestations, and cognitive anxiety is more or less like your thoughts, if you will. And so we don't know exactly what those thoughts were. So maybe they were but when we asked them, and again, it's a research study, so people knew that they were being tested on their max squat and so forth. But the people that were probably thinking about it more and more focused on it, is what I take from that data, tended to do better. And they did better than their predictions. So what we had people do was predict, like a self-efficacy. Hey, here's how much I believe I'm going to be able to squat today. And then those that had high cognitive anxiety tended to squat over that. Those that had high somatic anxiety, though, didn't. So I took that to mean, again, we don't know exactly what their thoughts were, but took that to mean those that were a little bit more focused. They were thinking more about the task at hand rather than being affected by something else that was outside or external to this. And again, if you're to the point also being that those that weren't as focused on the task, that might, as you put it, Mike, might not be under their control. Maybe there was something else going on where they were trying to focus on the task, and they thought they were focused as much as they could, but whatever else was happening in their life, or maybe it was even something like low sleep, but they just couldn't be able to focus as much. So I think it's a really good distinction I'm making, which is, just because something is psychological doesn't mean that you can control it, even when it comes to something like training.
And there's about 8 different directions that I would love to go in just off of that by itself, but I know that you've got to be out of time by now.
Soon enough, but we can do it again sometime, dude.
Yeah, I would love to do that. So, man, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, pick your brain on things, and get your perspectives, man. I appreciate your time.
Always, man. It's fun. I'll do this anytime you ask.
Anything that you want to mention or shout out or anything before we wrap it up?
Do I get to mention Mass?
Sure. Yeah. Whatever you like.
Cool.
I mean, I'll mention it for you if you want, because I love it. I get a lot of the way I look at it is kind of creativity fuel. It gives me ideas of things to try that aren't stupid, and so I can do some things that it gives me ideas for things that I can try in an individual's program that are probably good ideas, and that's a lot better than just the alternative, So
that's a good way to put it, though. Probably, right? Because we never know for sure.
Yeah.
You never know till it actually works. But
right.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, dude. But other than that, and if anybody's not familiar with monthly applications in strength sport with Greg Knuckles, Eric Helms, and myself, it's pretty cool. We have a lot of fun doing it. We review research every month. You can find it on Greg's site, Stronger by Science. But otherwise, just want to say thanks, man. It's really a pleasure to be able to do this and be on with you, and just the discussions that we've had over the years, and just to be able to watch RTS doing what it's doing and to have it impact so many people is pretty cool. So thanks for having me, and thanks to you for what you've done for kind of the sport, and always been willing to have conversations with me, and to see. It's cool to see how our opinions and thoughts and ways of discussing have evolved over the years from when we first started talking maybe 6-7 years ago, It's a really, really cool thing. So nothing else to plug. Just thanks, and I'll be here anytime you want.
All right, sounds good, man. We'll definitely do it again.
Cool.
Reactive Training Systems.